Good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Rackley, as I said before, the Energy and Environment Program Director at the National Governors Association. On behalf of the National Governors Association, NGA, we'd like to welcome you to the first day of our Stormwater Equity Experts Roundtable. We would also like to thank our funder for this event on the next slide, the William Penn Foundation. The foundation's work focuses on several priority areas, one of which is protecting the Delaware River watershed. For a brief overview of NGA, we are the bipartisan voice of the nation's governors. My colleagues also involved in this event, Bevan, Tim, and I, are in the NGA Center for Best Practices. We are the nonprofit grant-funded arm of NGA. We work directly with governors, environment, and energy advisors, and we are here to help provide assistance to these advisors through a number of forums such as convenings and research memos. The next slide, the slide that we're currently on, provides an overview and goals for this experts roundtable. We're here today with state representatives from all 4 of the Delaware River Basin states, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, to discuss equity issues surrounding funding stormwater management. Our goals for this meeting today and tomorrow are to identify strategies for states to use to help local communities adopt equitable stormwater funding structures, discuss combined and separate sewer systems and funding strategies for stormwater management, such as using general funds versus dedicated fees, and to highlight equity and environmental justice considerations. An important note is this meeting is meant to be discussion-oriented. We want to hear your questions and recommendations based on your experience. You can ask questions by either unmuting yourself in Zoom or can enter questions into the Zoom chat feature. The next slide shows the agenda for today's meeting. We aim to end today and tomorrow promptly by 12:30 p.m. Today, we'll hear about a new EPA funding program for stormwater management, and then we'll begin hearing from experts and having discussions on equity considerations in stormwater funding. A preview of Friday's agenda is on the next slide. Our hope for this experts roundtable is that state water policymakers learn from each other and leave this event with ideas for how to address some of the stormwater funding challenges they are facing and ensure that the Delaware River watershed is protected. Thank you again for joining us here today. I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Bevan Buchheister.
Thanks, Jessica, and welcome everybody. And we're so glad you're here. And we're very excited to, kick this off and have you start learning from each other. I do first have to go through the obligatory housekeeping. So slides will be distributed to everybody after the meeting and posted on the NGA website. We are recording the presentations, but we are not recording the Q&A because we want to really facilitate candid discussion. So we will, before we head into Q&A after the discussions, we'll let you know the recording has been turned off. You're encouraged to turn your videos on during the Q&A period and put your slides in gallery view so you can see everybody. You're welcome to turn your camera off during speaker presentations. And of course, we count on everybody to take care of themselves and do some self-care during this. We know that that these Zoom meetings are very long and everybody has Zoom fatigue. It's a real thing. And if you need to, just put your camera off and go get a drink of water and things like that. If you're having connectivity problems, you might want to log off and choose the call-in function. That should be in all the emails that Timothy sent you. Also, if you're having other technical questions or difficulties, you can contact Nataki Hemmings from NGA, and her email is in the chat. So also wanted to mention that NGA, we will be taking notes, but we are not going to attribute any comments to anybody, and we are writing a follow-up paper after this, so we might contact you to get more information on something you said or questions you asked, but we're not taking notes for attribution to any particular speaker. So I wanted to start by just tying this discussion to the larger context of water affordability and equity. So as you can see, this slide's been up for a few minutes, and you've had a couple minutes to look at it. So over the last decade or so, water rates have increased 31%. This is due to aging infrastructure, lack of investment in infrastructure, changing demographics, more costs with environmental cleanups, and the impacts of climate change. Of course, that's going to keep happening, and we haven't addressed that yet, even though water rates have increased at a sort of unsustainable rate, higher than the rate of inflation. So there's obviously really disproportionate impacts on low-income individuals and communities, and you can see that there on the right, and our other speakers will go into that as well. So affordability is considered 4.5% of your income on your water, all your water bills. So what we want to ask ourselves during this meeting. So if stormwater is already a part of your constituents and residents' water bill, are the charges really equitable? And this really came up during a retreat that we had with a particular state, where we were going through the whole exercise of looking at rates and equitable rates and how you charge equitable rates. And then one of our commentators said, I'm from a low income jurisdiction. We just can't charge another fee because they already can't afford their water. And then, so, we had a discussion with him like, well, is it equitably charged right now? And if it's not, how can you fix that? And if the stormwater is not part of their water bill already, then how can local governments sell a new fee to make it, to restructure it so it can be equitable? And if a community can't take on another fee, what can states do to help environmental justice communities? So and that's the context of the larger water affordability issue. And, we just really want to dig in today and look at this, stormwater affordability, because it's a real, part, and will be a growing part of water bills as we move forward. And we, the impacts of climate change are more severe. So go ahead, next slide. So just to frame the day for everybody. So how are stormwater practices funded currently? Through general funds, bonds, stormwater utilities, or fees. And I think Andy's going to get into that, like, what are the equity considerations of all those different things, different practices, and the different ways the stormwater fees or utilities are set has a real impact on equity as well. And then the states, of course, help out with the clean water state revolving funds, and how are they being used, and can they be used better? And then there's some federal programs, and we're going to hear about some new federal programs as well, and how can you pull in different federal programs and sort of stack capital, and how can states help localities with all these different methods of funding. So next slide. So just to give you some kind of overview of the state, and we're going to thank Warren Campbell. This is from his report, the Western Kentucky University of Stormwater Utility Survey. So looking across the country, there's about 2,000 stormwaters nationwide, stormwater utility fees. They're not like a red or a blue state thing. As you can see, Washington State up there in the left-hand corner has 127, and then Texas has 121. So it's not a red or a blue state thing, but I mean, it is a very locally set thing. And, states can help localities figure this out. As you can see, the difference in the range of fees, 0 to 45 per month. The average fee is $5.87. When we look at the Delaware River Basin states, New York has 1, Pennsylvania tops the list with, is that 36, I think? Yeah, Delaware has 3 utilities, and New Jersey has 0. But in New Jersey's defense, they did just pass the enabling legislation in 2019. And as they were, starting to ramp that up and help local jurisdictions figure this out, then COVID hit. So of course, nobody can pass an extra fee during COVID. So
Pennsylvania's up to 54 now. I've been able to find.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. And Warren, we have a question. Why are some of the states red and some blue?
Those are the red states are the ones that voted for Trump in the last election.
Uh-huh.
Oh, wait a minute. This is 2020. So voted for Trump in the last election. Blue states are the ones that went for Biden.
Okay.
And not only that, interestingly enough, the average fee in blue states versus red states are within 2 cents of each other.
Wow. Okay.
So
Yeah. So this seems to be like a bipartisan kind of issue here. But I think one of the things to take away too is there seems to be very few stormwater utility fees in the states compared to the need that's out there. So and then when you get into fees, you really need to look at what is the most equitable design of fees. So New York City, last I could find out, it was based on water consumption. Now, what kind of relationship does that have to your contribution to stormwater? Alexandria was based on your property tax rate in 2017, and then others are basing it on the impervious area. So we will hear from our speakers about, and especially tomorrow, about how they worked with their local jurisdictions to adopt an equitable fee and how they did the messaging and how they calculated the fees. So we're looking forward to hearing from them tomorrow. Go ahead, next slide. And then, so really our constituents, our members, our governors, advisors, so we want to get out of this, this meeting, and we want to hear from you, all of your ideas about what can governors and states do, because we've had the question of, well, this is a local issue. Localities are the ones that adopt the fees and set the rates, but there are actually a lot of things that states can do. And, we jotted down from speaking to you and from working on this for years. What can governors and states do? Funding for local stormwater practices, grants for EJ communities, technical assistance, providing data to help them figure out how to set the fees. We're going to hear from the SRFs today on several of those things, streamlining applications. So we're going to hear about that as well. And guidance on equity messaging. How do you tell the local jurisdictions, well, it's not really fair now, so here's how you can explain this to your constituents. Information on federal resources, and then we want to hear from you about any other ideas that pop up. And so feel free to put that in the chat anytime that you think of something, and we're going to save the chat. And we just want to make this really interactive. Go ahead, next slide. So we want to start out by getting everybody very comfortable with each other, and we want to ask all the states to give a little background on what your stormwater challenge is and related to equity, and what you are excited to learn about today. So if I could, I would just like to start calling on the states. And we want to have the state introductions, and then if we have enough time, we will ask all of the rest of you to introduce yourselves, except for the speakers, because we're going to give them a little introduction.
Hey, Bevan, maybe before we go to the state folks, can we give Nathan?
Oh, sure, yes.
Yeah, just because I know he's on, and
right. Okay.
Just a couple of minutes to introduce himself and what William Penn is working on in the
Delaware. Yes, please.
Watershed.
I appreciate that, Jessica and Bevan. And I'll be brief. So the foundation has an interest in all four of the Delaware River Basin states. And we're really looking at the connection, I think we all acknowledge as water and environmental professionals, the connection between land use and water quality, really seeing water quality as central to quality of life in our region. I think the other data, right, the other piece of data that's just come out is the census data for 2020. And while we're seeing the slowest rate of population growth in the last, in recent times, that population is still growing. And with that growing population is a growing footprint on our landscape. So when we look at our Delaware River Basin system, which is just portions of each of your states, each of the 4 states, but a good representative a microcosm of what you're experiencing across your wider jurisdictions, where 20% of this 13,000 square mile landscape is already in a developed land use. We're losing forest at the rate of 2,500 acres every year And all of that is having consequences for water quality across the 25,000 miles of rivers and streams that comprise the Delaware River Basin system. Over half of those streams are impaired, and some 5,000 miles of streams are impaired with stormwater or urban runoff listed as a primary or secondary cause. So we know that this problem is expensive to solve and requires creative solutions, solutions that leverage every dollar we have available, but also solutions that respect and acknowledge that there are different conditions in different communities, different abilities to pay, and the solutions have to reflect that ability so that those individuals in those downstream communities most impacted detrimentally by the impact of stormwater and other forms of pollution, not being asked to bear an unjust burden in terms of addressing that fix. So glad we're joining together to learn here across all 4 states. Some of the oldest states right in the country with the oldest infrastructure, shared issues around combined sewer overflow as much as MS4 and municipal permitting issues. So thank you again for participating, and thank you to NGA for putting together a really awesome program for these next 2 days.
All right, thanks so much, Nathan. We appreciate your support and are looking forward to hearing from everybody. So I want to invite the state teams to introduce themselves and pick one person from the state to give us a 1-minute background from your state, and then have the rest of the state teams just introduce themselves and tell which department you're from. So I'm gonna pick on New Jersey first and see if Patricia Gardner or Janice Brogel is on the line.
Yes. Hi, this is Pat Gardner. I'm the Assistant Commissioner of Water Resource Management in the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And I think the hurdles for New Jersey are what we've been talking about already. It has to do with, environmental justice, CSO communities, funding, watershed management, and political will to move the process forward. I'm going to now introduce Associate Commissioner Katie Angerone, and she can provide a little bit of update on the rulemaking and other processes that we're going through right now.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you, Pat. And we do have Janice Brogel and also Gabe Mahan with us from New Jersey. So I think Pat hit the nail on the head. There are a lot of constraints in New Jersey, right? We are a home rule state. We have 565 municipalities. Our infrastructure is owned a little bit differently than other states. And our communities, our municipalities, like every municipality across the nation, have issues with respect to technical capacity, financial capacity right now, political will, as Pat talked about. But we also have a lot of opportunity right now. We are integrating at the state level in our agency and every agency in the state of New Jersey, environmental justice and climate. And so we are undertaking quite a few rule efforts. And DEP is trying to model that behavior for the rest of our sister agencies and go first, right? We have to trailblaze. That's our job. So we are taking on some stormwater rule forward-looking rule amendments that will talk about precipitation as it's going to be, not as it is now, because we know that a lot of the data that we use to manage stormwater is backward-looking. And then with respect to EJ, particularly in our long-term control plans and in our CSO communities, we are really dedicated to making sure that we are finding solutions that make sense and that are affordable. We are also reorganizing internally to make sure that we are reconnecting water and land use. For many years under the last administration, they were kind of disconnected a little bit. We built some really great water connections, and we're going to lean on those hard in the future. But we somehow looked away from the land use connection. So we are also doing crafting a networked watershed plan to make sure that those two programs, which are housed in different places at this point, are really working closely together. We're doing some brainstorming. We've talked to DC, we've talked to some of the stormwater experts who are on the line today, and we're info gathering so that we can start to identify those solutions that we can cherry pick from given our constraints. So that is a process we're going through, and we are excited to talk about integrated permitting, community-based solutions, and all the sorts of tools that I think we're going to hear about today. So thank you for pulling this together. And thanks to our team for being so dedicated to taking this issue on.
All right, thanks so much, Katie. Did we want to let the other New Jersey folks just introduce themselves so we can see who they are? I had Brianne, Callahan, Gabriel, Mahone as well. We're on the
Why don't you
line.
turn your cameras on and say hello, folks.
Hi, I'm Janice
I'm
Brogel.
Gabriel. Oh, sorry, Janice, go ahead.
Hi,
I'm
Janice.
Janice Brogel.
Cameras on and say hello, folks.
Hi, Janice
Gabriel. Oh, sorry, Janice.
Hi, Janice Brogel.
Gabrielle, did we hear, was that you or was that?
Director of Efficiency.
Hi, I'm Gabriel Mann. I'm the manager of the NIPD's Stormwater Program and the Water Quality Management Program from New Jersey.
And,
I'm Gabriel Mann, manager of the NIPD's Stormwater Program and the Water Quality Management Program from New Jersey.
gone. If you were a little garbled the last time.
Maybe it's not turning on. I'm so we're primarily on stormwater utility. I work primarily on stormwater utilities in New Jersey. And everybody's definitely consideration of consideration for us.
Okay, I think that was Brianne. It was still pretty garbled. You might want to call in if, yeah. And if you want to chat with Nataki on how to do that and use your phone for audio instead, that might work better. And you can leave your video on as well. But let me move to Pennsylvania and see if we have Aaron Wachter on the line from the governor's office, and then Brian Chalfant, Ruth, I didn't write your last name so legibly, and then Rebecca Kennedy. So let's have Pennsylvania leads introduce themselves.
Hey, this is Brian Chalfant. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I know Erin's planning to be in and out. She's got some other meetings going on.
Okay.
But I'll go ahead and kind of touch on some things that Pennsylvania, first off, I'm Brian Chalfant. I'm the Deputy Policy Director for Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. I work with our DEP's water programs. So I'll touch on some of the things that DEP is doing, and then a couple other things that the administration more generally is working on. I think Rebecca can talk about some of the aspects that PennVest, which is the entity that manages our state revolving fund monies, has going on. But and on the DEP side of things, and also I apologize for the disembodied voice. Working extra remotely today, so I know we're all working remotely, but I don't have a camera set up right now. But yeah, so I think on the stormwater fees, particularly that, as you know, Professor Campbell and his students over the years have documented that, you know, Pennsylvania has seen kind of a, I don't know, relatively explosion in stormwater fees over the last like decade. And some of that, I think a big piece of that was due to the state legislature, you know, amending the statutes that govern, you know, local governments, and kind of making it explicitly clear for some local governments that they can do, you know, that they have the authority to implement specifically stormwater fees. So I think that's been a big piece of it. And then also the, you know, kind of just the first mover dynamic that, you know, once kind of the first one was established, some other local governments in the state looked to, you know, Philadelphia was the first municipality in the state to enact a stormwater fee. And then once that was in place, some other local governments in the state, you know, kind of realized like, hey, this is a thing we can do, and kind of diffuse from there. But, you know, from DEP's end, you know, we don't really have the, you know, authority or purview to, you know, influence what local governments do, like whether how they fund their stormwater programs, I guess, generally, whether that's through a stormwater fee or, you know, property taxes. Those are kind of local decisions, although we're definitely interested in doing what we can to, foster the development of kind of more regional or watershed-based, getting some collaboration on a watershed basis. That, stormwater is follows gravity, not political boundaries. So, what we can do to kind of help municipalities get to funding stormwater on that kind of regional watershed basis. And one of the ways to do that is through, particularly with DEP, is the MS4, kind of joint permitting, like, having, if a group of municipalities in a watershed wants to join together to do stormwater financing, being able to incorporate that in the MS4 permit. And then another thing, just real quick, is that we're currently involved in updating our state water plan in Pennsylvania. And as I think Katie touched on well in New Jersey, that, kind of one of the key priorities that's coming out of that is we're kind of midstream in that process, but it's, been a very clear message that we've heard across the state that, that connection between land use planning and, stormwater flooding management, which, DEP is updating the state water plan through the, kind of statewide committees, but also more generally, the administration is interested in that, making that connection a little closer and doing what we can to influence, the land use planning and the stormwater connection side of it through the state planning board and some other entities in the state. So I'll leave it there. Just also want to note that Professor Campbell, I'm glad to see you here. I feel like we've done a bit of a stormwater funding world tour recently, so nice to see you again. And I'll pass it off to, I think, Rebecca.
Yeah, well, that's over time, so I won't add anything. I'm Rebecca Kennedy. I'm the project manager for the eastern third of the state for PennVest.
Great, thanks so much. And then do we have Ruth Hawker on the line as well? Okay, maybe she'll join later. Oh, okay, hi, Ruth.
I'm sorry. Good morning, my name is Ruth Hawker. I am the director of the Pennsylvania office for the Center for Watershed Protection.
All right, well, welcome, thanks so much. All right, let's turn to New York, and do we have Carol Lamb LaFay on the line?
Can you hear me? I'm not really proficient at Zoom, so
yes,
hopefully you can hear me and see me. So I'm a little late to the game. I was just invited, I think, Monday or Tuesday, so I may not be as prepared. I'm the Bureau Director for the Bureau of Water Permits, so I oversee both stormwater as well as, municipal, all of our permitting program. Previously, I was the section chief for the stormwater program, but it's been a while. But New York is also a home rule state, so planning and land use decisions are made at the local government. We have a wide range of municipalities, ranging from very poor small villages to New York City. New York City is covered by their own individual permit, and we have been working in the last couple of years. Their first MS4 permit was issued just about 6 years ago. So we're working on the second round of their permit, where they're developing more of the land use, the construction, stormwater, post-construction. They're actually implementing a post-construction permitting program where they will actually have permits after construction is completed to make sure that the practices that are being installed are actually being maintained. And they're working to adopt standards that would be applied citywide. So really looking to integrate both the CSO and the MS4 communities, and recognizing the value of, the private land, because development and implementing practices in their right of way is extremely limiting due to all of the fun stuff underground and the limitations. So we've been working with them. New York has a lot of state coalitions of the different MS4s. We have about 544 MS4s, which would be the urbanized areas throughout New York State. Those are, they vary as well. The coalitions are typically aligned by region. So we would have Central New York, which would encompass the Syracuse area. Western New York is Buffalo, Rochester. And so the municipalities work together to try to, fund things through shared services, don't recreate the wheel, education and outreach, inspections. So we've really attempted to provide them with a lot of tools where they can get the economics of sharing their services and getting credit for the work that they're doing. We do fund some of the MS4 implementation, such as mapping, not so much maintenance, but construction of stormwater practices as well. Mm-hmm. And we do work with the Environmental Facilities Corporation. I think Brian and maybe Brian Hahn and Brian Jory are on the call. And they've been really instrumental in getting the GI program up and running, because when we adopted the GI standards in 2010, I believe it was a different way of approaching stormwater. And so we met with a lot of resistance, and they've been really, really great getting practices in the ground and building our capacity. But the limiting factor for New York has been the perceived notion that there is, a lack of state legislation, enabling legislation that would allow them to create stormwater utilities in districts. Although I believe that the city of Ithaca may have adopted their own program, but I've been out of that end of things, so I'm not really current on how they're doing as far as, they're having the ability to pay for stormwater by charging a utility fee, which is really what should be done, because these are utilities, they're services that are being provided that without them, there wouldn't be the ability to develop in that area. So, we're looking forward to hearing what other states are doing, and I probably went way over time. So,
oh yeah, thanks. That was really interesting, Carol. I was taking lots of notes. Well, we'll let Brian. I'm going to introduce Brian Hahn later because he's speaking later today. So we will skip over to Delaware. Do we have Terry Deputy on the line?
Yes. Good morning. I'm Terry Deputy. I'm the director of the Division of Watershed Stewardship for the Delaware Department of Natural Resources. There are 3 sections within that division: our conservation program section, our shoreline and waterway management section, and our watershed assessment and management section. So what is of particular interest is our conservation program section, which is responsible for our sediment and stormwater program, our non-point source pollution program, drainage, and flooding programs. We also have a financial assistance branch that is separate from my division, but we coordinate very closely with them. And the focus has been recently on trying to make water and wastewater projects affordable. Not so much of stormwater, but we also provide surface water matching planning grants to help municipalities and communities plan for their stormwater needs. But most of our focus has been on wastewater and drinking water. We are incorporating EJ into everything that we do as a department. So we are taking a very close look at all the financing that we do in terms of providing assistance to communities to make sure that they are more equitable and justifiable to the populations that we serve. We have 2 primary drainage programs: our conservation program and development program, which was a result initially developed in 1995 as a result of a settlement with the state of New York for abandoned properties. And so we pretty much have exhausted all of those funds, and we currently still have roughly about 1,200 projects on the list for drainage needs, estimated a cost of more than $110 million. We do about, I would say, 100 projects per year, in roughly about $2.5 to $3 million a year. We also recommend new projects every year, so the list never really gets down. We recommending another 140 projects for consideration in our next fiscal year. The other drainage program that we have is a tax ditch assistance program. So in Delaware, there historically are a lot of farming areas that have drainage needs, and they have developed a tax ditch assessment program to have those landowners essentially assess themselves to put in infrastructure for drainage. Over time, that those farming areas have been developed substantially now that we have communities, we have residential developments. So we're struggling now to basically readapt that tax ditch system that was mostly geared at agriculture to a more residential approach and appropriate fees. Not sure what everyone knows about Delaware. It's relatively close to all the rest of the states, but we have less than 1 million people, 3 counties. Newcastle County has 60% of our population, and Kent and Sussex counties are 20% respectively. What more? So challenges are trying to target financial assistance to EJ communities in a micro-targeted way. You may have a stormwater project that affects a broader area than which a EJ community may incorporate. The question becomes, how do you target assistance, particularly to homeowners and individuals that really need the assistance in terms of affordability? The other issue is that we believe that we have the capacity to pay for capital costs, and but the issue becomes ongoing maintenance costs. How do you make projects affordable even if you bring the capital cost to zero? And you have ongoing O&M. So those are some challenges for Delaware. Happy to be here to discuss issues around stormwater and EJ assistance.
All right, thanks so much, Terry, and thanks for queuing up a lot of those good questions too that we hope our speakers will answer for us. So now I want to turn it I thought we'd have time to introduce everybody on the call, but we really don't. But I encourage you all to look at the participation list. I know Timothy sent it around again today. We have a lot of great organizations on the line, and we have several academic institutions, University of Delaware, Western Kentucky, Rutgers, University of Maryland, and University of Pennsylvania. So we have a lot of good thinkers on the line here, and they're going to help us work through all these issues that you all have raised. So let me turn it over now back to Jessica, and we'll kick it off with our first session.
Thank you, Bevan. So we're first going to hear from Michael Gorelchik from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and he's going to talk about, on the next slide, a new stormwater funding program that EPA has available that states may be interested in pursuing. So next slide, please, Timothy, and then we'll hand things over to Michael. And just as a quick kind of heads up reminder, so we should have around 10 minutes at the end of the next session for some questions from folks and discussion from folks on the line. But for Michael's presentation, if you have any questions that come up when he's presenting, if you want to put those in the chat feature, we'll try to come back to them when we have time. And he's going to speak for about 10-15 minutes. So with that, thank you, Michael, for joining us, joining us here today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound great.
Awesome. I'm on my phone. All right, so hello, everyone. My name is Michael Gralchik, and I'm with the U.S. EPA's Office of Wastewater Management, and I work in the Clean Water State Revolving Branch, which many of you are probably very familiar with. And also, as a Philadelphia, born and raised in the Philadelphia area, this whole area is special to me, so I'm glad I got to speak to you all. So EPA has a new grant program, and the grant program is specifically for overflows and stormwater. So this is great news, one, because it's a grant, capital G, means it's free money. So we hear a lot of issues coming from all over the country that SRF loans are wonderful, but they want grants. So this is a way that we can start into that. Okay, next slide, please. So what this grant program does. So this grant program is separate from the SRF. So it's a different program entirely, but it was designed by Congress to work alongside the SRF one for ease for the states, and as a way to support this cause, since we know all the work that we're doing here is also eligible from the Clean Water SRF. Now, what this program is a grant program for states. So the state, the District of Columbia, or the US territories can take this money that's based off an allocation formula. So every single state entity gets a cut of the pie, and then they use that pot of money to issue subawards to municipal entities for the design, the construction, or the planning of CSOs, SSOs, or stormwater projects. So, and that's basically it. So that's a pretty, there's not many other restrictions. I'll go over them later, but if it's a runoff project, if it's a runoff issue, then chances are it's eligible by this. When we say stormwater, we need runoff over the landscape. So we're not tied strictly to an MS4 permanent division. So this could be rural areas, this could be non-point source areas in agricultural areas. So there's a pretty wide level of flexibility. And also, unlike the SRF program, this money can go to private or public projects. So if the municipality wants to operate a project on private property, as long as it's following the eligibility criteria, then that's eligible. Now, who gets these projects? So the state gets to decide based off their priorities what projects need this the most, but they have to follow one of 4 different categories. So the community either has to be a financially distressed community, and that's defined by the state. So whatever state criteria uses, that's their decision. Or they have a long-term control plan for CSO or SSO abatements, or they have an SSO, CSO, or stormwater project on their IUP. Also, the 4th one, which doesn't apply, it's an Alaska Native village, and I don't think that applies here at all. So if one of those 3 entities match, then that community is able to get these funds. And the only other the only other requirement we have is there's a 20% Green Project Reserve requirement. That 20% of the funds state uses has to go towards green infrastructure, water conservation, energy efficiency, or environmental innovation, just like the SRF. And there is a 20% state match. But that 20% state match comes from the state grantee. It doesn't have to come from the municipality. So if the state wants to pay that match and that put that money into the pot, they can use that bucket of money for whatever projects, and they don't have to pass on that burden or that state match to the municipalities. Also, that match can come from the SRF, from the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So, but it would have to be recycled funds or non-equivalency projects. Okay, next slide. I forgot to mention the last slide. Currently, there is over $67 million for the program from the last 2 appropriation years. I know that's not a lot of money when we're talking about overflows and stormwater projects, especially when you cut it 56 ways across the country, but it is a start, and we do expect that money to grow. And as we know with the current administration's focus on infrastructure, that could very well be a vehicle to get lots of dollars out to the communities and quickly, since this program is up and running. So we do have an implementation that EPA created to explain how the program should be implemented. And we are currently giving training to the states in helping them prepare for how to set up their program and work with their EPA regions to get their award. Okay, next slide. All right, so status of the program. So the program is up. So the application information is available on grants.gov, and interested states who want to take their allocation are encouraged to work with their EPA regional coordinator so they can begin working on their work plan and start getting their application together. And I said before, this is an allocation-based formula. So everyone gets a cut of the pie, and that allocation was based off the needs for CSO, SSO, and stormwater needs based in the latest Clean Watershed Needs Survey. Now, little caveat, this is not new information. This is not new data. This data is from 2010, so it's currently being updated. But as of the moment, we're using that latest survey, but we also bolstered the information with precipitation and population metrics to make sure every state has a better representation of their need. Okay, next slide. All right, so basically, why am I speaking today? Why is this important? EPA has a lot of grants programs. So I think the reason that this is important and impacts a lot of the stormwater space is just because it's grants, so it's essentially free money to these projects. It can help support disadvantaged communities, which also creates initiatives that help environmental justice programs and initiatives. And it's a way to get these projects started. We hear from a lot of states that there's just no money to get stormwater projects off the ground, or they're too expensive. So we believe Congress initiated this program as a way to maybe jumpstart those projects. So this money can be used with other projects. So once the cost share requirement is satisfied, this money can be used on other bigger projects as a way to co-fund them. So we envision this money being leveraged with states as a way to maybe start an SRF project or start a multiple phase project that gets continuous grants from the OSG pot every year with an appropriation. So for example, if there's a project you want to work on or start planning design for an overflow abatement project, you can maybe use OSG money to start the planning and design. And once that design is ready to go, then maybe plan for an SRF loan or SRF, an SRF ad sub grant in collaboration as a way to jumpstart that program. So we see this as a way of grant money to drive down the ultimate cost of this imperative infrastructure need. So I think that's all I have as an overview. If we have time for questions, I would like to open that up.
Yeah, so we've received a few different questions in the chat, and I know, Michael, you're great. You went very quickly. So the first question that came in, well, I'll just ask for a clarification from Bevan that came in. So I heard that you said that practices on private land, projects on private land could use the funding. Is that correct?
That is correct. So the way the statute works is we're mainly focused on getting projects that are reducing, treating, reusing, managing overflow or stormwater. So if that happens to be on land that's privately owned, that's still adhering to what the purpose was. And then obviously EPA it's a grant, it's a federal grant, so federal grant requirements are in place. So the municipality would have to make sure all those requirements are being met.
Okay, great. And then another question that came in, and it's regarding, are any states leveraging the EPA grant dollars with state grant money to address greater community needs beyond the 20% match?
So that we don't, the program was opened up in April to accept applications. So we don't have any of the work plans or the spelled out projects or the plans that states want to do. But yes, we have heard from some of regional coordinators hearing that this money will be used in addition for greater or bigger projects that are funded from other sources or other state grant programs. So we do see this as a chunk of money being used on greater projects to drive down the cost of those projects. So, or some states want to use this project for just a standalone project and be done with it. But because the need is great and the dollar amounts are high for some of these projects, we'll see this being a co-funded element. But it's up to the state's decision ultimately.
And then another question was regarding, are there like streamlined applications available? A lot of, low-income communities tend to lack the capacity to, fill out kind of complicated federal forms.
Sure, absolutely. So this is going to be the state's discretion. So the state has a lot of flexibility of how they want to operate their pot of money and issue it to their sub-awardees. So once the grant has their money or has access to their grant, then they can design the easiest way to get that money awarded to those sub-award projects. So if you're Pennsylvania and you have your award pot, you put in your 20% match and you want to do 5 stormwater projects across the great city of Philadelphia, where I'm from, then you can work with Philadelphia in getting that project up, that application going, and it's meeting those sub-award requirements. Hopefully that answers your question, but maybe that was muddy as water, muddy as clarity.
And Michael, one other question that came in, well, there's a couple more, but just with time and we're kind of running out of time, just wanted to ask one last question about, do you have the specific or know the specific amounts that have been based on the allocation formula that was released in February that have been granted to the Delaware River Basin states? Do you?
I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. I can tell you that out of over 67 million, Pennsylvania will get 3.5% of that. New Jersey will get 5.7% of that. Delaware will get 0.5% of that. And then who am I missing? And then New York gets 6.4% of that.
So, out of what total? 68 million? Is that correct?
I'm sorry?
What's
the total, as of right now, the total pot is $67 million. Yeah, a little over.
Yeah, I was curious about that, and this morning I went through your formulas. So it looks like New Jersey is going to get 3.9 million based on the 5.7%. New York's going to get 4.35 million. Pennsylvania 2.38, and Delaware it's around 340,000, based on the allocation percentage and the 68 million. Okay, so thank you so much, Michael. If you are willing to stick around, we might have some time for some additional questions that come in around 11:15 or so. And with that, I will first I'll now hand things over to Andy Kreikin. Andy has a lot of experience in this area. He's currently the managing director of Moonshot Missions, a nonprofit focused on providing technical assistance to water utilities in underserved communities. And he's going to just provide a little bit more background and context on the issue. And then we should have some time for questions for Andy and then for Michael.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks to you and to Bevan and Timothy for the invitation to participate and the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And thanks to Nate Boone and the William Penn Foundation for funding this. I think it's such an important issue. It's also personally great to see so many friends and colleagues and to cross paths with so many nice people again. So thanks on all counts. I think with regard to the equity of stormwater funding, I think there's 2 takeaways that I'd like people to have from what I'm about to say is that, first of all, no action on funding stormwater is absolutely not equitable. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, there could be some variations as to whether or not this approach is more equitable than that approach, et cetera, but not funding it at all, not having some sort of stormwater fee for impervious surface, especially in combined sewers, is absolutely not equitable. So the no action alternative is the least equitable approach. So that's one takeaway. And the second, and Bevan alluded to it already, is that when you have an inequity in general, there's always a disproportionate burden on low-income households, obviously, because inequity hits low-income households harder because it's a higher percentage of their total income. That's just common sense. And so it's imperative that this issue be addressed and that that some action is taken, and you can always tweak the program and make it more equitable or less equitable, but doing nothing is absolutely inequitable, especially to low-income households, and isn't acceptable. So that would be if you take one thing away from what I've had to say, and now see people turning off their computers and walking away for the next 15 minutes. But anyway, that's the main takeaway. With that said, I want to also divide the issue between combined sewers and separate sewers, because it isn't a one size fit all. There are similar circumstances and considerations for both, but there is a difference, especially with respect to cost and impact. And I'm sure everyone on this call knows all this, so we'll touch on this quickly. But combined sewage, we're talking about combined sewer systems. You know, when let's say you have flooding in your basement or flooding in your streets or your parks, if it's a separate stormwater system, that really is a problem to have, you know, flooding in your basement or in your streets. But when it's a combined sewer system and you have sewage backing up in your basement or kids walking through puddles of combined sewage to get to their bus stops, that is a public health issue, that is a social justice issue, and just isn't acceptable. So there's that. And then in addition, as Jessica mentioned, I currently work with Moonshot, the nonprofit, and I also work with Howard Newkrug at the Water Center, and he's on the call. And so I also work with U.S. Water Alliance, and I see my friend Katie Lackey on the call as well. But before that, I used to work at the wastewater utility in Camden, New Jersey, which had a combined sewer system. And you know, we calculated there that 35% of the flow in a normal rain event, not a Hurricane Sandy-esque year or it's a normal rain year for rain, 35% of the total flow received by the wastewater treatment plant came from combined sewage, from impervious surfaces. To illustrate, on a dry weather day, Camden will receive about 10 million gallons a day. And on a normal, let's say 1-inch rainstorm, you know, a strong rainstorm, but not a hurricane type storm, that flow will go from 10 million gallons a day to 100. And the combined sewer system was absolutely not, able to handle that. And what you'd have is sewage backing up into people's basements, sewage in the streets, in the parks, and also overflowing into the river. So you would have a double environmental justice burden in that you'd have the public health impacts of combined sewage backups, but then you'd also have, there's also an environmental justice consequence with respect to clean waterways, that people are entitled to have clean waterways to walk by, to maybe swim in if it's safe, et cetera. And so there was that. And so the other thing I will say about that, in addition to the environmental injustice from having combined sewage flooding or combined sewage overflows, it also is expensive. When you mix a gallon of stormwater with a gallon of sewage, you now have 2 gallons of sewage that you have to convey, pump, treat, et cetera. And so the operational costs are additive because of combined sewage flooding. I mentioned 10 million gallons to 100, for example, in Camden. Wilmington calculated 43%, Wilmington, Delaware calculated 43% of their total sewage received in an average year came from impervious surfaces, from the additional flow generated from impervious surfaces. And I recently calculated for Paterson, New Jersey, that it was about 35%. So again, you're getting that 35 to 40% of the total amount of flow received at a wastewater treatment plant. It comes from these impervious surfaces. And if you don't have a stormwater fee, then no one's paying for it, but actually everyone is paying for it. Mr. Smith and Mrs. Jones are paying for it. And that, is unfair to everyone. But as I said earlier, there's a disproportionate burden on lower income households, because if people are paying more than they should, that harms low income households more. And so that is sort of underscores my thesis that, especially on a combined sewer system, it is really completely unjust and unacceptable not to charge some sort of fee. Again, you can figure out what is the best way to, and you'll hear case studies about different systems and programs and approaches, but the no action alternative is undoubtedly, unambiguously unjust and inequitable. The other thing, and my colleague and friend Howard Newkrug can and will speak to this, I think, tomorrow, is it also serves as an incentive for private owners, because if there's a stormwater fee, then private entities would have the incentive to try to reduce or avoid the stormwater fee altogether by capturing and maintaining the stormwater on site. And a great illustration of that was a panel I served on about 2 years ago, where I was representing Camden, New Jersey, and all the other panelists were from New York City DEP and Philadelphia Water Department. And we talked about, we were talking about green infrastructure, and Camden and New York noted that, or Philadelphia noted, I think, and Howard will get this exactly right, but it was something on the order of 75 to 80% of the green infrastructure totally accomplished in the city came on private property because of the stormwater incentives, the incentive to reduce the stormwater fee. And Camden reported, as did New York City, that not 1 square inch of green infrastructure was put on private land. And when I was the head of the Camden wastewater utility, I could not convince, even though there were Fortune 500 companies in Camden, I could not convince them to give up 1 parking space or 1 square inch of private property for green infrastructure because there was no financial incentive. And so that just illustrates the difference. So not only is it a way to pay for operational costs associated with impervious surface, but it's also an incentive to reduce the combined sewage flow that you may have to deal with in your city because you can incentivize private entities to actually reduce their costs. So for me, it's very clear cut with combined sewers. With regard to separate sewers, it's a different story, I think. Although a direction I think is still the same. It's just the magnitude of the impact is probably not as great for the reasons I gave, the difference of sewage overflowing versus separate stormwater. But still, separate stormwater systems can sometimes be orphaned, that they don't, that they tend to be forgotten. They're not part of the sewer system, so the sewer department doesn't take care of them. Maybe in some communities own the road is public works, or it's the roads department, et cetera, but they're often orphaned and forgotten. And so having a stormwater fee to ensure that the operational costs and capital improvement costs needed to take care of them and maintain them, is a good idea. And again, when no one pays for it, everyone pays for it. And it really should be, since the stormwater is generated by impervious surface, it really should, go back to those who own it, especially those who own it in large quantities, like parking lots, parking authorities, and large, owners of impervious surface. The next thing I'll maybe get into is some of the barriers I've heard about it. Of course, in New Jersey, as Bevan mentioned, up until 2019, it wasn't legal to charge on this basis. So there's, if there's an institutional barrier, that's the first thing that has to be taken down. Another thing I've heard is that, well, we don't need more government. The idea of forming a stormwater utility, that's just one more layer and one more level of government. And that really is a misnomer, because in most cases, if not all, an existing entity can just simply charge a stormwater fee, just as a wastewater utility charges its user fee and then also charges a separate connection fee or a permit fee or review fees. They can also charge a stormwater fee. And so it's really just a matter of, you don't need to form a whole new apparatus of government in order to charge a fee for a service. I mean, there's also, of course, industrial pre-treatment permit fees, et cetera. There's a number of fees, and same on the in the governmental, whether it's a separate authority or whether it's Department of Public Works or sewer department, it's simply an additional fee from an existing entity, as opposed to needing to have a brand new utility or a new governmental structure. So that's one misnomer that can easily be addressed. Now, I will say, in the case of separate stormwater systems, if they really are orphaned, maybe it would make sense to have some sort of at least maybe a stormwater department or some entity that is directly responsible, as opposed to it being, catch as catch can, so to speak, as to who takes care of it. But the thing is, it isn't necessary to have a separate standalone entity. Second thing I've heard is this idea and I remember hearing quite a bit in Maryland, that it's a rain tax. And that really isn't so. I mean, it only is generated, it's like saying, when you have gunpowder in a match, you need both to cause the explosion. And yes, you need rain, but you also need impervious surface. And without the impervious surface, there would be no, combined sewage or stormwater generated. It would soak into the ground, obviously. And so that's one thing. I mean, another thing that could be done, if the state statutes allow it, to minimize at least residential opposition, would be to perhaps have it, a structure in which say the first, let's say if you calculate the average square footage of a typical driveway, a residential driveway, and say, well, the first 300 square feet are free at a very low rate, and then above that, it's charged, or having some sort of gradation. That's one way to do it, but that may not be legally possible, because in some instances, states don't allow that sort of thing. They require you to sort of charge across the board. But the other opportunity, and Bevan really brought it home to me when Jessica and I were speaking the other day, is that the savings need to be transparent. In other words, for it to be equitable, rates really need to drop for residential. If you're seeing that 30 to 40% of the costs of combined sewage treatment and conveyance are coming from impervious surfaces, then presumably, even if you are a homeowner that has a driveway and would see a slight uptick from that, the overall revenue brought in from the parking authorities and parking lots and parking garages and large swaths of impervious surface would significantly reduce the total revenue requirement. And so if residential entities, households see a net, they should see a net drop. And if the savings is transparent, then I think there'll be a lot more support. Whereas if the extra revenue obtained just goes into some other part of your budget and it isn't apparent or transparent, that you're either cutting the rate or reducing a required rate increase. So, without this fee, your rates would have gone up by 8%, but instead, because of the fee, it only goes up 3%. The key is to make it that if there really is an equity benefit if it's done properly to residential households, it's important to make it transparent. People want to see that they really are paying less or paying less than they were or that they would have to because of this additional revenue coming in. Last thing I will say, I think there's still a bit of time, is with regard to affordability in general, is to note that the state revolving funds are really critical in making stormwater capture more affordable. When I worked at the Camden Wastewater Utility, I think the two things that were critical in order to improve performance and reduce costs and hold rates steady were internal efficiency certainly, but judicious use of the state revolving fund as well, with capital projects as well as stormwater projects. And I knew David Zimmer will be speaking later. I think he might be on the call now even. So I'll tip my cap to him. New Jersey not only funded green infrastructure through the SRF, through the New Jersey Water Bank, but also provided principal forgiveness, which is basically a grant. If you don't have to pay back a part of the loan, that is effectively a grant. And so I tip my cap to the New Jersey Infrastructure Bank and New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection for funding green infrastructure and making it eligible for SRF funding, but also incentivizing it further with principal forgiveness. So that also increased the affordability. One other option I'll just mention is open space funding is really a good opportunity. If you have a county that has an open space fund, that's a terrific way to reduce your stormwater capture, to create green space and reduce the cost burden on your ratepayers. So for example, one of the projects that we did in Camden involved using an open space grant for Camden City that had been unused for Camden because it didn't have a parks department. So we stood in for the city, got the open space grant to acquire a property that was an abandoned factory that had contaminated runoff running into the river. So there was a double water quality benefit, one with respect to eliminating the contaminated runoff into the Delaware River, but also, turning 6 acres of impervious surface into 6 acres of pervious surface in a combined sewer system, so capturing stormwater and reducing combined sewage flooding. The SRF, the open space grant, funded the acquisition. The SRF, or the I-Bank, funded the remediation project and conversion of the factory into a park, a riverfront park for an environmental justice community, and provided principal forgiveness for the first $2 million of the project. And so therefore, as a result, we were able to eliminate contaminated runoff into the river, convert 6 acres of impervious surface to pervious, which reduced combined sewage flooding in the neighborhood, and provided riverfront access to an EJ, an environmental justice community, at no rate increase because of the SRF. So I just want to encourage all of the states, on this call, the 4 states, but also all 50 states, to consider following New Jersey's example in funding and encouraging green infrastructure. And with that, that is all I have. So I appreciate, again, the opportunity and the invitation from Bevan, Jessica, and Timothy, and of course, Nate Boone and the William Penn Foundation for this entire program. And if there's time, I'm open for questions and answers. Well, questions, I don't know if I'll have the answers.
Thank you, Andy.
So it is 11:30, so we will get back to this great discussion, and thanks everybody for jumping in for that wonderful discussion on the last session. We expect to do the same at this session. And I noticed this one's about equitable approaches in funding and permitting. So we're going to hear from Ellen Kohler, David Zimmer, and Brian Hahn. And I know one of the questions in the chat that I just saw was about extending the time frame for achieving clean water in environmental justice communities. So Ellen and I had talked about that. So I'm going to ask her to touch on that. I think she will in the next in this session. So Ellen is the Program Director of Water Resources at the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center. She has more than 25 years of experience in addressing legal, regulatory, and policy context of water management and natural resource challenges. So her projects cross all three water sectors: drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. And a lot of her work involves direct support from municipalities, either individually or through multi-municipal collaboration. David Zimmer is from New Jersey. He's the Executive Director of their Infrastructure Bank, and they partner with New Jersey DEP and the Department of Transportation to provide low interest loans to governments, units, and authorities for environmental infrastructure projects and transportation projects. So we're going to hear about the great things they're doing in New Jersey. And then we're also going to hear from Brian Hahn. He's the manager of the Green Policy Planning and Infrastructure Unit at New York State's Environmental Facilities Corporation. He's responsible for the development of green infrastructure policy and its implementation into programs, as well as managing the daily operations of multiple green grant programs. And he has served in this role for 15 years. So we're very excited to hear from each of you. And let me turn it over now to Ellen.
Thanks very much, Bevan. And I'm going to resist the urge to jump in and comment on everything we've just been talking about and run through my slides quickly so we can get back to questions and discussion. So just quick background on the Environmental Finance Center. The one at University of Maryland is one of 10 around the country. We work in EPA's Region 3. We do partner with our sister center at Syracuse to work in the Delaware and the Chesapeake, both in New York and New Jersey. And I've been working in the Delaware River Basin now for more than 7 years. Next slide, please. We've already touched on some of these common revenue sources for funding stormwater management. What I want to stress here are a couple different things. One, depending on the source, you might be able to fund capital. Well, you cannot always fund capital. You might not be able to fund operations and maintenance. So this is a running theme. Terry brought it up in his comments, but the maintenance issue in terms of stormwater management is a significant challenge. Also, what we see in terms of working with communities is the mix of revenues varies for every single community. So you might have folks depending on their general fund, but the revenues making up that general fund can vary from each, within municipalities, say in Pennsylvania. One might have an earned income tax and one might not, or one might have a larger, percentage of income tax, earned income tax making up their general fund than others. And that makes a big difference. Like in COVID, during that time, some of those communities didn't see any change in their general funds and some did, depending on that revenue mix. Most of my comments going forward here are not going to really be about fees and the SRF. Both Brian and David will be talking about that a little bit, but I will come back particularly to the SRF stuff at the end of my comments. Next slide, please. So a couple further points about the maintenance piece. This is just to drive home why maintenance is such a challenge. On the left-hand side, we have sort of this timeline of a life cycle for a stormwater feature. And frankly, this could be for lots of different kinds of infrastructure, right? You have a big influx of revenue need when you're first acquiring that infrastructure. But the maintenance piece is actually a really big part of the life cycle costs for that facility. And if we're not figuring out how we're going to address that maintenance, we are not going to be able to get the best value out of that investment. So that's a really important issue to address. What we see, unfortunately, with a lot of grant programs is they don't allow you to fund the operations part of the stormwater management with grants. What I'm trying to encourage folks to consider both in the applicant side and on the grantor side is to think about, particularly with green stormwater infrastructure, that getting plant establishment and getting that facility to actual truly proper functioning condition is going to take about 5 years, so that grant period should at least allow for maintenance of those plants, of that green element for 5 years. We'll see how that goes. On the right-hand side, I'm sharing with you a map of what some water infrastructure looks like in the lower Lehigh watershed. And I'm bringing this up because we've been talking about stormwater in the context of combined sewers or separated sewers. And the picture in any individual municipality is, unfortunately, can be quite more complex. So if we take Whitehall Township right here, for example, and if you live in this part of Whitehall Township, you don't get your drinking water from any kind of a purveyor. The bright colored lines show the service area for drinking water purveyors. But you so you probably get your drinking water from a private well, and you may have your wastewater managed from a private septic system. We have a lot of people in the Delaware River Basin that is the case for them, yet they still live in an MS4 part of the community. So this tanned area is all MS4. So they're paying property taxes that are, going into the general fund that are paying for stormwater. Whereas a resident here is getting their drinking water from the Northampton Borough Municipal Authority, and they're paying their rates to that authority. However, the distribution system for that drinking water system is maintained by the municipality. So their general fund dollars are going to the maintenance of that distribution system. So when we talk about what the overall burden is for an individual resident, the utility rates are not the full picture. And so we need to be very cognizant of that when we're working in a particular community to fully understand what the burden is, and who's managing the operations, who's managing the maintenance for all elements of our water infrastructure. Next slide, please. And of course, in addition to just having this maintenance challenge, we have, as everybody's been touching on, the additional challenges of managing larger storm events with our stormwater systems, and also how we're managing those systems in an equitable way. I want to point out with respect to the climate change issue that when we're looking at stormwater management, and some of the graphics that we've already looked at sort of pull this out, when we're looking at commercial and manufacturing land uses, we have to keep in mind that these heavier storm events are creating different kinds of challenges around the kinds of pollutants that we may be seeing in our floodwaters, whether they're extreme flooding events that result in huge influxes of all kinds of different pollutants, as we've seen in some of the major storm events, or whether we're talking just runoff from an impervious surface at a commercial or a manufacturing site. Those kinds of pollutants are very different from the kinds of pollutants you'll see in runoff from a residential property. So if you have a large chunk of your stormwater coming from facilities that have, say, maybe a lot of petrochemicals in them, for example, that creates a different stormwater management challenge than the runoff from, say, a residential property. So in terms of the costs that we have in actually addressing the pollutant challenges, the kind of land use can have a really big impact too. When we turn to the equity question, I'm not going to sit here and say that EFC has figured this out. We are starting to work with communities and starting to ask questions so that we are getting a better sense of how the inequities are being played out. And these are the kinds of questions we're starting to address and ask. Has the community been consulted about identifying the problem and the solution? Is the solution designed so that the maximum benefit is being realized where the problem is located, both in terms of the project outcome and in terms of financing? So what I mean by that is, if the project is being implemented right near where, so if you've got a community saying, this is a little bit, goes to CSO kind of an issue. If you're implementing that project right where that CSO is happening, then that environmental burden is being lifted right where that issue is, right for that particular community. But if you're deciding to implement a project that is upstream, then that, and depending on how far upstream, then that particular community is not actually getting the water quality benefit. The water quality benefit is happening upstream, or maybe, in some other location, but they're helping pay for it. So the money is being extracted from a community and getting sent somewhere for that benefit to be realized. So we want the benefit and the solution to be as closely linked as possible. And then we need to look at our financing mechanisms and which are the best for which communities. Can a community handle any more debt? Do they actually have the capacity to handle more debt? And if they don't, can we develop more grant resources? We need to be making more direct investments in our environmental justice communities. Next slide. So in addition, we need to be more creative at looking at the different resources that are out there already. On the federal side, there are a bunch of programs that are really well aligned with respect to stormwater management. So these are just a couple of examples. We can be looking at the FEMA funding around the BRIC, building resilient infrastructure and communities. We can be looking at USDA urban forestry programs. We can be looking at the RCPP funding that can be developed in a way that it works at a watershed scale. And all of these are great resources that we need to be looking at. And there are a ton more out there. And so we need to be creative about thinking about how we can get federal resources to hit the ground, particularly grant resources. Next slide, please. And state programs play a really important role in terms of some work we've done in the lower Lehigh. What we found is that the SRF dollars are important for paying for a lot of the big projects, but these state programs are absolutely critical in terms of some of the smaller scale projects. And I realize there's a lot of text on this slide. The basic point is Pennsylvania's got a bunch of state programs that run through their Commonwealth Financing Authority. They have a variety of different funding sources, from gaming and tourism revenues, from Marcellus Shale gas impact fees to the Motor Vehicle License Fund. These are all grant programs. They send dollars to municipalities for these variety of different kinds of projects, and they are always tapped out. So the flip side of this is these are very competitive grant programs, but they're filling a really important need for a lot of these communities. We also know that these grant programs right now are being used really effectively on the drinking water and wastewater side, not as effectively on the stormwater side, and certainly not as effectively with respect to green stormwater infrastructure. So we need to be getting more creative about even using these kinds of programs to address stormwater management. Next slide, please. And we need to be thinking about who we can partner with to provide that capacity that a lot of municipalities don't have, a lot of our communities don't have, in terms of understanding where some of this funding is, where some of these revenue streams are, and how it could apply for their municipality. And so I'm referring to this group of folks as liaisons or partners or go-betweens or intermediaries, these entities that can help municipalities with the capacity with building their capacity. I think we need to be a little bit more, I'd love to see us think a little bit more about who these partners are and what their motivations are and whether they align well with our community motivations and values. So I think having more go-betweens that are in a nonprofit structure, like the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, which is a nonprofit, or trying to leverage more of the community development financial institutions that are really community-based, that are really trying to get capital out to under-resourced businesses and community entities. And finally, the Family Forest Carbon Program is really that link between a landowner and the carbon market, right? So who are these folks that can help us make these links? And, are their values, are their goals aligned with our community goals? I think we need to see more of these kinds of liaisons and partners, more in a nonprofit structure, more in a certified B Corp structure, to help our communities with managing their stormwater. Our goal here should be that every dollar that a community is spending creates as many co-benefits for that community as possible and stays as close to the community as possible, right? So that we're using folks who work and live in the community to help provide, to provide the services that are needed for stormwater management. Next slide. So just a couple of quick conclusions. Even though I didn't say anything about SRFs, I just want to make the point, and Andy sort of made this point too. SRFs, the state revolving funds, are our most affordable source of debt financing for communities. So if they're going to use debt financing, this is their best shot, right? It's the lowest interest rate they're probably going to see. we do need to see whether our SRF programs are addressing our biggest water challenges and whether those dollars are getting to the communities that need those dollars the most. And we want to make sure that those SRF programs are thinking about natural infrastructure as part of that water infrastructure that they fund. I think most of them do, but you know, we want to push that as far as we can. And I think, by the way, we also want to push this in terms of how our federal legislation talks about infrastructure, right? Like with respect to the current infrastructure bill that's being discussed, natural infrastructure should be included as part of what we mean by infrastructure. I made the point already about whether a community can go into debt. If they can't go into debt anymore, they probably can't afford any higher rates either. State programs are really important in terms of filling those gaps. We know that some of these, that PennVest is great for larger projects, but it's not hitting the ground in every municipality. And, you know, PennVest only has a certain number of staff folks. They do a great job. They've got a variety of different programs out there, but they can't do everything. Same thing for WEAC in Delaware. And I only mention those two because Brian and David are from New Jersey and New York, so they'll talk about their states. We got to get funding out for planning, So the points that Michael made with respect to this new funding bucket and anything we can do to get money and support for planning is really important, because you cannot get to the PennVest door or the state grant door without that planning done. So that's really important. And we got this huge backlog in terms of maintenance challenges. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sure we're going to you know, circle back to some of the questions and comments that people have made already. But I'll turn it over, I think, to David, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. And Brian Chalfant from Pennsylvania said that that was only page 1 of their funding program. So they have a lot of other programs as well. And I also want to say, you brought up something about the need to connect partners with the municipalities that didn't have capacity. So I wanted the states to think about what could be the state role in doing that. They're convening, they have good convening authority and connecting. They're very good at connecting people and groups, things like that. So just for our conversation afterwards, let's think, you know, want the states to think about their role in that. So let me, turn it over to David. David, let us know what you're doing in New Jersey with the Infrastructure Bank.
Sure, and thank you, Bevan, and certainly to your peers, Jessica and Timothy, for the opportunity to address this group.
David, your volume is a little low. Can you turn yourself up?
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so can we turn to the first page? Great. So for folks that don't know, we keep talking about what an SRF program is, a state revolving fund program. Just very, very briefly, what happens every year, there are federal grant funds that get made to the states for the state revolving fund program in both the clean water and the drinking water programs that are administered by EPA. And so every state gets a portion of the, I think it's like 1.6 billion on clean water and 1.1 and change on drinking water. And it's split up by formulas. Michael Gorelchuk went over a little bit of the way formulas are set on the clean water side previously. So we get these funds in, and the state has to put up match funds, and that all goes in the program, and they have to stay in the program, which is a key. It's actually a great thing about the SRF programs is those funds cannot leak out for general budget purposes or anything like that. They're typically given to a grantee. That is like the state EPA or the state DEP. In New Jersey, the program, we call it the New Jersey Water Bank. It's co-administered by the grantee for the funds, which is the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. You met the Assistant Commissioner in the previous session, Pat Gardner, and her director, Janice Brogel. They are our partners in the SRF program together. They handle the technical side of things. We handle the credit, the legal, the finance side of things. Together, we review projects and make these funds available. Then what happens is you make the loans out, the loans get repaid, they come back into the state repayment fund, and they keep getting lent out year after year after year. So just for a point of reference, this has been going on for a little bit more than 30 years. The state of New Jersey, just to give you a ballpark of what this can grow into, we get roughly $88 million a year from the feds in this program, we currently have over $3.2 billion revolving for stormwater, for drinking water and clean water projects, including stormwater projects in the state of New Jersey. So that's the SRF program. Next slide, please. So how do we focus on providing equitable funding for stormwater, right? One of the biggest programs that we've got is CSO, combined sewer overflow abatement projects, are at the top of our list on the clean water program. And what we do is we make very cheap funds available for green and gray projects that reasonably reduce net flow going out of a CSO. And as you can imagine, a lot of these projects get done in the urban communities. A lot of those urban communities are socially disadvantaged, EJ communities, communities of color. And that's where this state has chosen to focus and prioritize this funding. So the way that we make this possible is we provide 50% principal forgiveness. And that is a fancy legal term for saying, we can't really make you a grant under this program. It's very difficult. So we're going to give you a loan, but we're going to forgive that loan immediately when you start to construct a project. So we give these principal forgiveness loans up to $2 million. And then the remainder of that 50%, half of it is in a 0% loan with these SRF funds. And then the other half we go out and we borrow from the state. From the public market. There are roughly 28 states, I believe, in America that leverage their SRF programs and make more funds available than just the grants. And that's how we here in New Jersey do it. So you'll end up with a project up to $4 million. You'll get half of your money you won't have to pay back. The remaining half of that will be at 0%. And the other half will be at our AAA market rate. So you're basically getting half of your funds at one half of the AAA rate. It's a great deal. Anything above the $4 million, we fund at 50%, 0%, and 50% market rate. So again, just really, really cheap loans to address CSOs. And I believe I think there's 17 communities in New Jersey that are CSO communities. And again, you're going to find them in the Camdens, the Newarks, the Pattersons, right? The communities that are very much socially disadvantaged. So we're kind of putting our money where our mouth is. Next slide, please. Something else that you may consider, right? Technical assistance. And I believe both Dominique made a comment about this, and I know Ellen just got done talking about it, right? A lot of these socially disadvantaged communities have issues with even just knowing about our programs, or if they know about them, putting together an application in that, right? So we want to make sure that we provide equal access to our programs, particularly for communities that bear a heavier relative burden, whether it's a lack of financial resources, human resources, skill sets, et cetera. You want to make sure that those people aren't inadvertently excluded from these projects and from this available funding. So the first thing is just A, making sure they're aware of it, and B, to the extent that they are, holding their hand so that they can come in and get the planning done and provide you with the minimum amount of information for us to start the review project. Because I could tell you, talking with my 49 other state peers, once somebody notices us that they want to take advantage of our program, we smother them, right? We want to get that project done, but we need to know what the project is, roughly how much it's going to cost, and the desire to borrow from us first. So again, one of the very, very, I think, highly useful approaches that states can take to make SRFs more approachable is to provide that technical assistance right up front. Next slide, please. Okay, so then we've got, and I'm not going to go into this a lot because Michael Gorelchuk did a great job talking about the new OSG program. It is relatively small right now at roughly $68 million in total funding. We all expect that to continue and possibly grow. I will highlight again, as Michael did, this is not an SRF grant program. It is a general grant program to the state. So in some states, you'll find that it may end up in the SRF program and it may be levered. or it may not. But certainly, one of the priorities is to focus on financially distressed communities. And most of, if not all of, our EJ and socially disadvantaged communities are financially strapped. So it's a pretty straightforward approach to say, when we get these grant funds in, we should want to focus on EJ communities and see if we can fit them into CSO and SSO priorities. But again, that is going to be on a state-by-state basis. I would tell you that New Jersey, we've not come out with our plans yet. That's going to be the purview of both our DEP commissioner and the governor. But certainly, if you're in New Jersey, stay tuned, because the department will certainly be putting out guidelines and guidance when that decision is made. Next slide, please. All right. So we come across this a lot, right? In stormwater funding, towns only own so much land. The majority of land is owned by homeowners and by private property owners, by businesses, right? So if you really want to be effective at managing stormwater in your community, you have to involve private property. And one of the ideas that's out there, that has been out there for a long, long time, and I will say that New Jersey has not put this program into place, and I don't know if we will, but certainly there are places, states like Ohio, Maryland, Iowa, Minnesota, Oregon. There may be others. Those are just the 4 or 5 that I know of. And what link deposit programs are is, when we're sitting on cash and we haven't lent it out yet, right? We still want to make that cash available to projects. Well, I can tell you, if somebody comes into our program and says, you know, I've got a $30,000 septic replacement project, and I'm a private homeowner. First of all, you don't qualify for our program. Secondly, even if you did, it would be very difficult for us. You know, our average loan size is $4 to $5 million. We just don't have the capacity in-house, and not that we couldn't build it, but it would be difficult for us to take on a lot of these small $30, $40, $100,000 type loans, right? So what some states have decided is they're actually going to go out and work with local community banks, and they invest in a certificate of deposit at the bank. And they set up a program with that bank, that bank is to use those funds on that certificate of deposit specifically for program objectives. The program objectives would be to do green infrastructure, stormwater, septic type projects to private homeowners, to local small businesses, et cetera. In doing that, we're just making an investment. It would be very similar for us, like we're taking our cash that we're sitting on and investing it in short-term treasuries or agencies or commercial paper. Instead, we're buying a CD from a local bank. And that local bank is making a loan. Local bank is taking all the risk, right? The local bank can loan to a private homeowner or a private business. And in doing so, there's some relief, limited relief, to certain requirements that the SRF program has, right? You don't have to do a NEPA review, the bank and the homeowner. So again, I would direct you to some of those states if you're at all thinking about something like this, or certainly if you're in those states and you're unaware of it, contact them and get some information on it. And then lastly, at the very, very end of last calendar year, the federal government passed what they call the STORM Act. And this is, so we're thinking outside the box, right? We're not thinking EPA or SRF programs in EPA. So FEMA makes grants through the STORM Act to states and tribal communities to establish hazard mitigation revolving loan funds. You know, I saw this as it was going through Congress, and I'm like, holy mackerel, that's exactly what we do, but we do it for a different widget. So SRFs are perfectly situated in every single state to go in and petition FEMA as their state's representative for this new STORM Act program. You know, I highly recommend that when people, if they're thinking about setting this up, you focus on, it's for resiliency projects, right? So you want to focus on low-lying, flood-prone areas. Well, a lot of those areas are disadvantaged communities. They just don't have to be the wealthy storm communities. They're upriver. I would consider not just projects in the areas that flood, but kind of as a counter to some of the stuff that the very good points that Ellen was making about spending money where the benefits are, right? Sometimes you'll get a project upstream that will mitigate the flow downstream. And so if the benefit is downstream and you're spending money upstream, right, that's a very good use of those funds. And then I don't have this on a slide, but kind of my throwaway before I hand it over to Brian is the new ARP Act, right, that was just passed. All the states, the counties, the municipalities are receiving federal government funds, and there are certain requirements and qualifications for those funds. And so you're thinking about, okay, broad for capital projects, it's limited to water, clean water projects, drinking water projects, and cable. Well, clean water projects are stormwater projects. But let's not just think about EPA, let's think about transportation. So how many transportation projects have stormwater runoff issues? And those stormwater runoff issues cause flooding issues for communities, or at least contribute to it. So kind of as a throwaway, I would encourage people to work with their state DEP/EPA and EPA on these ARPA funds and see if we can't designate some of those capital funds for stormwater projects at our state and county DOT level. And that's it for me. I'll also be around like Ellen for questions after this. So Bevin, I'll turn it back over to you and Brian.
Thanks, David. Let me just throw you one question that I saw in the chat. One of our participants said that obviously you all have figured out how to get these SRF funds out to EJ communities, and looks like you've done outreach to them. What kind of technical assistance, what did that look like? And did you involve any nonprofits or consultants? What role did they have? How are you actually making that connection in the EJ communities?
So we did two things, and I still think we have some ground to make up, right? Nobody's perfect, and you always want to continue to just improve yourself if you can. But there is a nonprofit group in New Jersey, the New Jersey Future, that went out and hired a consultant to work with us in the DEP and did an overview of our program and really keyed in on green infrastructure projects and the hurdles that existed for folks to come into the program for these projects. So there was a review of the program, and that review highlighted this exact issue, that it wasn't so much once people came into our program that there were issues, but it was just trying to get into our program. So a couple of things that we've done is we've created a portal with what we believe are easy step-by-step instructions for people to come in. So you don't have to call somebody, you don't have to get on the phone and talk with anybody and feel like you're committing anything. There is a way that you can go into our portal and start the process on your own. There are folks here at the iBank that are designated to take phone calls if people do have access issues that they can call. One individual in particular that is kind of like our support rep. It's very good at walking people through. And then one other thing that we did was we created a calculator on our website that allows people to go in and again, it's kind of blind to us, but you can go in and play around and put in your project costs, costs, etc., and you can get an estimate of how much it will cost you if you go through funding with the New Jersey Water Bank program, as opposed to if you went through and financed things with your own rating. There's a couple of questions you have to answer. One of them obviously is your current rating. And then we have a black box that we just run the numbers and give you the annual debt service number. So if you're an engineer and you know how much your project costs and you're wondering if you can fit it into the budget that your client has given you, you can find out exactly with interest how much your annual debt service would be. So you can go back and tell your client, hey, this works, you can afford this project. But again, I still think there's quite a bit more that we can do in terms of helping specifically EJ communities come into the program. Come back to me in another year and find out what changes we've made in the last 12 months.
All right, thanks. I also saw that in the chat that Camden said that they paired up with other more resourced utilities and supported by Rutgers University and New Jersey DEP, and to get resources into the environmental justice communities.
Yeah, so I will say, if people have not heard of Andy Kreikin, that's a shame. He is a national treasure when it comes to vision on running systems, particularly in low-income areas. Andy did a terrific job in the 20 plus years that he was down at CCMUA. He was one of our largest clients. And I do want to make one point here that I think is critical. Debt service, and we get this a lot, you know, can you afford to do that project? Debt service is never the cost of the project. And we hear that from mayors all the time. I can't afford it. The debt service is going to be X. And that's not the cost of the project. The cost of the project is the debt service minus the savings that you will get in your system because you upgraded your system. What Andy proved at CCMUA is that you can actually do these projects and save money. They can be budget positive. So CCMUA under Andy borrowed $220 million from us over a period of 20 years. And Andy's household rate dropped from, and Andy, I'm sure you'll tell me if I'm wrong on this, I believe it was $337 a household down to $315. He was able to reduce his rates.
Wow.
And he invested in funds because he was paying less for drying and hauling. He was paying less in terms of overtime on his breaks. He was paying less for additives. He was paying less for energy. So a huge, huge takeaway from my speech. If anybody takes anything away from this, please have your engineers, when you're looking at the cost of the project, estimate what you're going to save on that project, and then that's your budget impact.
Real quick, I agree with David on that, and the key was that as he said, that the debt service was less because the iBank, the SRF fundings, low interest rate and longer period of time to pay back, the annual debt service was lower than the operational savings associated with the capital projects. And so, as David said, it's not so much that how much you can't afford to do it, it's that you can't afford not to do it. That you're actually missing out on an opportunity to improve your environmental and public health service as well as lowering your costs. And that's thanks to the SRF. And we were lucky in New Jersey, and are lucky in New Jersey, to have a leader like Dave Zimmer at the head of it with it, who's willing to innovate and get funding out to EJ communities.
Yeah, and I mean, Andy, that they were, really blessed to have you in their community to be able to figure all this stuff out, but not every EJ community will have somebody that's talented and committed like you. But on another point that the participants just brought up in the chat, after the EJ communities have the money, what kind of long-term assistance do they get to make, ongoing project management to make sure that there's the proper use of dollars, drawdowns, the projects are built and performing properly? Is there any help for them there?
Well, during the oh, sorry, go ahead, David.
Go ahead, Andy.
I was just going to say that during the project, the infrastructure bank funds consultants that design it, they're designers and construction managers of the project. They provide project funding for implementation of the project, design, construction, and project management. After the project is finished, I mean, one example that Philadelphia and Camden used is to get AmeriCorps funding to get to develop an opportunity youth program to help maintain the green infrastructure that was constructed. So there are funding opportunities available to maintain the project, but you have to. But the key, though, and this came up in the chat, is that EJ communities often lack the resources to apply for funding and find the funding. So one of the things that's really, and especially with this new water infrastructure funding coming out, it's really critical to find ways to provide support to EJ communities so they get their fair share of funding opportunities like SRF, AmeriCorps, et cetera.
So if I could just follow that up, I want to make 2 points. First one, a little bit unrelated. I want to go back to Andy's kind words. I do appreciate the compliment, Andy, but everybody needs to understand finance authorities like the iBank, we implement the policies for addressing EJ communities, absolutely credit to the governor and to DEP Commissioner Latourette on that. It's their focus. And again, what we do is we implement those policies. But specifically with respect to assistance, and this is not New Jersey, this is the SRF programs. So when we make financing available, we're responsible. So we're responsible to all the bondholders that came in and gave us those proceeds to mix with our SRF funds to give to our borrowers. So the program, the DEP and the iBank are responsible after the fact if there are issues. So during construction, absolutely, we pay for, the program pays for a lot of consultants to help our EJ and socially disadvantaged communities get the project constructed. Once the project is constructed and we go to long-term financing and we borrow money from the bond market to do so, any issues with the IRS, any issues with the SEC, any legal or credit issues that, or with the trustee that befall that source of funds, that is on us. We manage it. We work directly with the SEC through our lawyers and the IRS, and you can imagine that's complicated and it takes a long time and it costs a lot of money. That's all absorbed by the SRF. So one of the huge benefits of borrowing through an SRF program is that we manage the compliance issues on our borrowers' behalf. And I'm going to apologize to Brian. Brian, I didn't mean our section to take up so much time.
No, that's all right.
That, you know, the answer
let's so let's turn it over to Brian now. So he'll have his. So Brian Hahn, can we get you to
on here, right? You can hear me?
Yes, thanks.
All right. No problem, Dave. Great conversation there. And both you and Ellen hit on a lot of pieces that are important to our program. So we can get this started. Can you go to slide 2, please? So the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation acts very similar to Dave's program in New Jersey. We're a public benefit corporation, and we provide financial and technical assistance to municipalities to provide low-cost financing for water quality infrastructure projects. We manage both the clean water and drinking water state revolving funds. And actually, to David's point about stormwater runoff, the picture here is the city of Olean in Western New York. They had a swath of impervious roadway and sidewalks, and they had a transportation project where they said, where can we reduce some of the stormwater because it's an environmental issue as well. And they created these roadway medians with bioretentions that take the roadway runoff. And also you can somewhat see it on the outside of on the right side of the picture, but there's also trees, and actually the street trees in the middle, which also are engineered cells that take roadway runoff and treat that runoff, filter it, and the small amounts that come back, filter back into the system. But it was a great way to incorporate green infrastructure into a larger transportation project. So I thought that wasn't going to mention that, but since David said his piece, we'll throw that in there. So can we go to the next slide, please? So New York State EFC functions largely like the New Jersey programs that Dave had mentioned in his category. So I'll just kind of blow through the initial aspects of that and get to the Green Innovation Grant Program. This is our primary green infrastructure program. It was created in 2009 when the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act came along. I think a lot of people that were involved in that remember different requirements that carried with the grant. Buy American and Davis-Bacon were two of the highlights of that, but also in there was the Green Project Reserve that EPA put in for the CWSRFs, actually, and drinking water as well. And there's a requirement on additional subsidization for that program, for those funds through ERA that required green spending. So what EFC did was create the Green Innovation Grant Program. It allowed us to meet that requirement. It also allows us to meet our New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Management Program for a lot of these non-point source projects. And since 2009, We have had around, it's a competitive grant on an annual basis, and we've been able to provide grant funds to $130 million in grant funds, 230 projects across New York State. And our grant percentages for stormwater source of this is up to 90% grant with a non-federal match. Next slide, please. These are our program priorities currently. We're actually and so I'll fast forward a couple years from 2009. We come to 2011. Governor Cuomo is elected into office. When he first got into office, he noticed that there were state funding programs for multiple agencies. They had their own timelines, their own applications, their own, maybe some were continually rolling, some were twice a year. And he actually created what they call the Consolidated funding application. So that took, on average, about 30 programs. It lumps us into one consolidated funding application where there's a wizard. So it's mainly for economic development, but there's also environment, arts, open space, all different types of aspects that you can come into and access this funding. Is really, we call it the one-stop shop for New York grant funding. And through that, communities have been able to leverage our funding for larger economic development projects. So if they were doing a streetscape revitalization downtown, they can green it up, use some of our practices and our funding, and just create a larger, leverage those resources, create a larger, better project. So that in a nutshell is how we get our funds out on the street. But these are our most current program priorities. Climate change mitigation, I know Ellen and Dave both touched on the severity of storms and the effects it has on our communities. So we've actually opened it up to a couple more categories in the recent year to include environmental efficiency and water efficiency. And then another main piece here for this roundtable is the environmental justice category. We've incorporated the environmental justice as part of our scoring probably for 3 or 4 years now, but we really, in this last round, took it to another level by providing higher grant amounts to communities in environmental justice areas or that are below the median household income. So we're really trying to incentivize our programs reach onto, disadvantaged areas. And through that, when we do our application, we found that a full engineering report was too much for what we're really looking for stormwater. So a couple years into the program, we created what we call a feasibility study. It's really geared towards stormwater. So it talks about your site conditions, your depth to bedrock, anything that might not be conducive for a green infrastructure project. And that evaluation has reduced the cost significantly for your application. So we've been trying to work with the communities from the beginning, because even during ERA, municipalities across the state were struggling to find funding for stormwater. Integration, it's usually the larger traditional gray infrastructure projects. There's a lot of pipes, there's a lot of larger components to that. We found that if you use bioretention cells that are connected throughout your street, you may be able to reduce a significant amount of stormwater going to your combined sewer overflow, which down the road will reduce the strain on a wastewater treatment plant during a heavy storm event. Natural resources, you may not see it in your immediate community, but upstream, we've had projects where they've removed berms, reconnected the floodplains, riparian buffers, stream channelization, and really that upstream improvement may have alleviated flooding downstream with these more, it allows the creek beds to swell up and go and run over into wetlands or floodplains rather than just be channelized and go down to the next community down the stream. And then transformation. These are projects that also incorporate some environmental justice principles, and they're larger, more regional projects or citywide projects that get at maybe economic development or revitalization, but also provide a social and environmental benefit. So next slide, please. And I know we have about 10 minutes left, so I'll just touch on this and then we can have some more conversation. So for our GIGP program, we're talking about green stormwater infrastructure. It's an SRF program, so we follow the capital project definition, design, planning, construction. We also, for all these streetscapes and stormwater projects, require the communities, and it's eligible for funding, to create a sign that shows how your project's working and educates the community how it's not just, maybe a green planted area, but there's actually an engineered cell here that's working and reducing your stormwater runoff. And we follow the definition for green infrastructure through the GPR and the practices, and they're listed here on the left. And when we talk about our eligible components, since funding, it's what the EPA says for green infrastructure as well. So it's communities, it's privates, it's not for profits. So we have a wide range of applicants every year. Next slide, please. And I just want to hit on a couple profiles real quick that we've seen as success stories. The city of Yonkers had a major revitalization initiative in their downtown. If you're ever on the Amtrak north of going from, New York City north, this sits right on the route. Previously to this picture on the bottom here, it was all built impervious area. There was parking lots there. And actually the Sawmill River was piped. So that water was just flowing freely right into the Hudson River. And if you're not familiar with Yonkers, directly to the left of that picture is the Hudson River. So it's directly flows untreated stormwater right into the river. So what they decided to do was daylight this segment of the sawmill, and this has been such a success story. I think they're on phase 3 or 4 of other areas that they've been daylighting as well around the city. But what they did here is created a great public park. Even daylighting a river like this, the effect that the sun has on the water and the reduction of fecal coliform, E. coli, different bacteria is amazing that they found in studies. So they improved water quality, improved the area. It's a very sought after area to live in now. There's mixed use, residential, low income housing there. They've done a great job with this project. And if you look on the top, they had other funding as well, but they were able to leverage through the CFA, our funding, and really provide an additional green infrastructure improvement element that they may not have gone that far had they not gotten our funding. And then one more slide, please. Also in an economic justice area or environmental justice area, as is the city of Cohoes, which is just north of Albany on the Hudson River again, combined sewer area. It was really a park that had gone into disrepair. Most of it was used for a parking lot. The city a few years ago decided to have an initiative to rehab. It's called Canal Square Park. They used on the top of that lower picture, I know they're a little smaller on the slide from our profiles, but there's actually a large area underneath each of those trees that can store and filter and treat stormwater. On top of that, it's a massive bioretention cell as well, but there's a grass pave area underneath all these seats here. And what the community did was they built an amphitheater, which we didn't pay for because it didn't have a direct water quality benefit, but the area below it is grass paved. So we really do treat this whole area. And at the same time, the city decided to do a community event where they have concerts I think it's Wednesday night. So they're free concerts. They're a little older acts. You might get Boys to Men or somebody from the 90s there, but the communities love it. Other cities in the area do it. It's a free event for the community, gets them out, and just encourages, some more community involvement. And it's just another way that our funding for green infrastructure has helped go towards another project with larger benefits to the community. And then is there one more slide? I think it's just our contact information. Yeah, so I know I kind of breezed through this, so we have a little bit of time for conversation at the end. If you have any questions, you can contact myself or my colleague, Brian Jory, who almost had to give this presentation. My wife is due any day, so had an alternate available. But if you have any questions, reach out to us, and we're more than happy to help.
Thanks so much, Brian.